Hello, I'm Julie Posetti and I'm the Global Director of Research at the International Centre for Journalists, ICFJ. I'm based in Oxford in the UK, although as you can tell from my accent, I am Australian. And I'm here today to talk to you about a crisis in freedom of expression, a crisis facing women journalists, women public communicators all around the world. It's about online violence. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen with you. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a global study into online violence, which was commissioned by UNESCO and which I'm leading for ICFJ in collaboration with women journalists and academics and a number of civil society organisations from around the world. We're looking closely at 15 countries, the experiences of women journalists in those places, but also we've done a global survey of women journalists around the world to try to assess the impacts and incidence of online violence. And today I'm going to present to you some of the findings, some of the truly alarming findings from that survey, which was conducted in November and December 2020, in the midst of the pandemic, of course. So we know that women and marginalised and non-conforming people really do bear the brunt of online violence. And while the perpetrators range from anonymous bots and trolls right through to world leaders who are seeking to chill critical journalism, and among them is, of course, Donald Trump, who by the time we speak will have exited office in the United States. But we need to understand the scale of this, not just about the sources, but also the vectors for online violence, the impacts, and try to identify more meaningful ways to respond to the crisis, which is genuinely a freedom of expression crisis, a gender crisis, and a journalism crisis. And it's one that has potentially deadly consequences as these threats spill offline. So we surveyed, as I said, over 1,000 people originally, and we whittled that sample size down to 901 journalists, editors, and others who practice journalism from 125 countries. You can see there that this is a really diverse demographic picture. We have a blend of global South and developed West countries, ranging from Mexico through to Nigeria, with some European countries and the USA, of course, in the mix. Most of our respondents were either journalists and reporters and investigative reporters, or top editorial leadership. And the bulk, 76%, were aged between 25 and 50. We also had a really diverse mix of racial and ethnicity identifications. So you can see there that Hispanic and Latinos, along with Black Africans and white Europeans, were up the top of that list. So quite diverse for a global survey of this kind, meaning we're able ultimately to glean some useful insights into the sorts of intersectional risks, so the sorts of extreme online violence that women from racially diverse and gender identifying diverse backgrounds might experience. So we're going to give you here some of the top findings from this snapshot, which we published very quickly after the survey came to a close in November. So what we found was that 73% of the women journalists we surveyed said that in the course of their work, so while they were doing journalism, they had experienced online violence. Now, we can't compare this to other surveys that have been done in the past, but this is both the largest cohort of diverse, internationally diverse participants, and this is the highest ratio of reported online violence among journalists in any such survey that's been done to date. So we think this is really a benchmark survey. So what sorts of experiences did the women who participated in our survey identify? Well, almost a half said they'd been abused with hateful language. Just less than a half said that they'd been targeted with unwanted private messages. And that's something I have to say in my own personal experience is a constant irritation. It's a form of harassment that is unnerving because it comes into your life through the most private parts of your social media activity, your direct messages, your private messages, and so on. About a quarter had received threats of physical violence as a result of interactions in their online communities. 18% had been threatened specifically with sexual violence, and the same number said they'd been subjected to surveillance. So I've chosen there to highlight some of the main types of experiences that were identified. And you can see what that means. That means that online violence is not just about harassment and abuse, it's also about digital security and privacy threats. So there are really three components. There's often prolific abusive language, which can include gendered and sexualized and racialized attacks. Attacks that come in the form of threats to do physical harm, such as commit acts of sexual violence, for example, murder. And we found, in fact, that in 13% of cases that respondents said that the threats were also levelled against close family members as a way of trying to get to them, to chill their reporting, for example, to silence them, to shut them up, to stop them speaking. So on top of that, the third element, as I said, is privacy breaches and digital security attacks. So they can take the form of attempts to intercept forms of surveillance, phishing, malware activities, and even right through to deep fake videos, which involve journalists being falsely represented in porn videos, for example. So where you'll see a journalist's head superimposed on a porn star's body as a way of trying to discredit them or do moral injury to them. Important to note too that one of the key trends we observed is that 41% of our respondents said they'd been targeted in online attacks that appeared to be linked to orchestrated disinformation campaigns, including by the state. And there are some celebrated cases of women journalists who have been at the intersection of these kinds of threats. Maria Ressa in the Philippines, for example, Rana Ayub in India, and even Ferial Haffajee in your own context in South Africa. So who are the top perpetrators of online violence against women journalists, according to our survey respondents? Well, I suppose it comes as no surprise that over half were unknown or anonymous assailants, according to our respondents. Sources or contacts also represented a substantial number, so 15% there. And colleagues as well. 14% of respondents said colleagues, journalistic colleagues were among prime offenders. But have a look at this. Government officials, 14%, politicians, 13%, and also political or party officials and workers, 10%. So we're looking at around 37% of our respondents identifying political actors, making them the second top identifiable group of responders, perpetrators of online violence. And that very much correlates with what I mentioned just a moment ago about the ways in which disinformation campaigns really leverage online violence targeting women journalists as a way of trying to shut them up. The other point to note is that there are particular story types too that women journalists reported were like lightning rods to these sorts of attacks online, and 16% identified disinformation stories, so stories that were debunking disinformation or stories about disinformation networks, for example. But the top issue that attracted online violence was gender. So 47% of our respondents, nearly half, said that if they wrote about gender, they were likely to get attacked. Then politics and elections was the next most likely story type. 44% of our respondents identified that. then human rights and social policy, where we had about a third of our respondents saying this issue really attracted abuse. Then immigration, refugees and asylum seekers at 17%, along with investigative journalism being top issues that the journalists who responded to our survey felt increased the risks that they faced when it came to being attacked. Now, no analysis of online violence would be complete without consideration of the role of the platforms as vectors. This phenomenon we're speaking of really is a product both of hostile and toxic online communities enabled by the platforms, the places where now we work as journalists, where we have to interact with our audiences as part of the new ecosystem for information, including journalism. And there is one platform that stands out as both being the least safe, according to the women who responded, and also being the one that they were most likely to complain to about online violence, and that is Facebook. So 12% of our respondents rated Facebook as very unsafe, which made it among the 5 platforms that were the highest use platforms, also the one deemed to be least safe. The other thing to note is the failure to respond to those complaints when they were made, and the failure to deal with women in non-Western and non-Anglophone environments. These are some of the issues that we're starting to see. The women we spoke to also talked about the need for the platforms to take greater responsibility and be more accountable for this problem. So what about the impacts on the women themselves? The top impact really, if we're thinking of impacts on their well-being, for example, was mental health issues. So 26% said that they had experienced mental health problems as a result of online violence. 12%, in fact, of our respondents said they'd sought medical or psychological help to deal with the problem. 11% said for that reason they'd even taken time off work. The other really notable impact or response on behalf of the women is the propensity to self-censor. You can see there that about a third of women said that they self-censored on social media as a result of being targeted. And this is part of strategies of avoidance and strategies of silencing, where women seek to make themselves less visible, which is the antithesis of this campaign, to speak out and speak up, of course. So 20% of them said that they avoided interaction online altogether. 18% said that they specifically avoided talking to their audiences in the course of their work. And such measures could be considered defensive, as a way of trying to preserve one's safety, but they also really demonstrate, unfortunately, the effectiveness of online tactics that deploy attacks and abuse and harassment to try to chill critical reporting and to silence women's voices, to muzzle truth-telling. So the professional toll that it takes on women as well, women journalists, is particularly in evidence. 10% of them said they'd experienced damage to their employment prospects or their professional standing. But as I said, some of them are really withdrawing. We had 11% saying they'd permanently withdrawn from online communities. 9% had asked to be taken off air or to have their bylines removed, literally asking to be vanished as journalists in response to online violence. And 8% said they'd retreated behind pseudonyms. Also really important and alarming, about 13% said that they'd felt it necessary to increase their physical security in response to the online violence they'd experienced. And 2% said they had left journalism altogether, which added on top of the 4% who talked about quitting their jobs, which you can see on the slide there, and the quarter who had reported the problem to their employer. We have a very serious problem indeed. And the real seriousness of this issue is underscored by this statistic here. 20% of the women journalists we surveyed said they'd been attacked offline, so IRL, if you like, in the real world, in connection with online violence that they'd been targeted with, so that they saw a direct correlation. Some of them talked about the fact that the language that had been used to attack them was language that had been associated with hate campaigns online, for example, and others mentioned to them even, their usernames online. So this is an incredibly alarming statistic. I mentioned that some had increased their physical security. 4% of our respondents said they'd actually missed work or changed their working patterns because they were afraid of offline assaults and attacks associated with the online abuse they'd experienced. Now, this is really worrying, and this is the call to action. So only a quarter of respondents felt comfortable telling their employers about what they had experienced, so suffering in silence, which is very familiar for women who've been involved in decades worth of activism to deal with sexual assault and sexual harassment offline in the workplace and generally within society, this stigma around speaking up. So 10% though, this is the really alarming stuff, said that their employer's response was to do nothing. In fact, that was out of a large number of options. That was the top ranked option that they identified when describing what their employers did. 9% said they'd been told to, quote, grow a thicker skin or toughen up because online violence is just part of the normal work routine now. It's something we just have to put up with, which both fails to recognise the serious offline consequences, but also really minimises and diminishes the genuine psychological injury that women journalists are suffering while trying to do their jobs in the online space. And really disturbingly, 2% of the women who responded said they'd been asked what they had done to provoke the attacks. Again, putting the blame on the women themselves for being targeted and harassed and abused, in some cases with potential or real physical consequences. And you can see from this slide as well that the support on offer to the women we surveyed was meagre indeed. And it's important to note that the pandemic has made things worse. So 60% of the women we surveyed in a separate study that we're currently running with Columbia University's Tao Center for Digital Journalism said that things had gotten much worse since the pandemic began. We published this study in September 2020. And things are definitely deteriorating as a result of the increasing stress and strain and the kinds of responses that we're seeing at the intersection of conspiracy theories and online hate, misogyny, and a range of other issues such as racism and the rise of the far right, and the way in which all of this is swirling in the pandemic to create a really dangerous atmosphere for women online. So some of our preliminary findings, which I'd like to leave you with, include the need for political actors, and I can't believe I have to say this, to stop mounting attacks on women journalists, because the objective, which is to chill them, to silence them, although it might have short-term effects, ultimately it will not work. Women will not shut up. Women will not shy away from telling the truth. They will not be silenced. Ultimately, we will stand together, we will speak, and we will demand our place at the table digitally and also physically. Women journalists, of course, shouldn't be blamed for the online violence they experience, and nor should they be expected to burden themselves with responsibility for dealing with the crisis, whether that be in the workplace or in some other context. The platforms should ensure that they are responding swiftly in multiple languages and appropriately in line with international obligations designed to preserve gender equality online and also press freedom, journalism safety. States, countries should ensure that the laws and rights that are designed to protect women who do journalism offline, also in the online world, And we think that one of the most important ways forward in dealing with this crisis is going to be collaborations between academics and civil society organizations, journalists and their networks, so that we can identify more effective and holistic and collective responses to this freedom of expression crisis, which really is a pylon of a kind at a time when we're struggling to ensure that women's voices can be heard in the midst of a pandemic. And that's all I have to share with you today, but please do stay in touch. You can use the hashtag #journalists2, and I'm speaking throughout this event, and I hope you'll join me in raising your voices too.